All right, here we go. Welcome. Good morning, everybody. I am excited to kick off our last in a series of 6 conversations that we are calling Why Church? So the big question that we have been asking ourselves is, in an age when the fastest growing religious demographic in the United States are the nones, those who identify as no religious tradition, now that is again, not only the fastest growing, but really the single largest religious demographic in the United States. And in an age when the church seems to be so complicit with so many of the movements and policies and politics that are bringing real harm to our communities, the obvious question is, why in the world would anybody choose to still be a part of a church? And for those of us who are still working in a church space, what does that mean for us as we think about how to faithfully bring the gospel to the communities that we are a part of? And so today we're going to tackle our final question. What is the future of evangelism? We've talked about the gospel, we've talked about worship, we've talked about discipleship and leadership. And so for me, a really important question is there a place for what we have traditionally called evangelism, given all of the questions we've already tackled? And if so, what does that look like? And how do we do that faithfully as people who are committed to the ethics of the person that we call Christ, that we organize our lives around? And so I have a panel of guests who join with me today from all over the world today. So I'm just going to go around the room and introduce them and give them an opportunity just to say hello and introduce themselves a little bit as well. First, we have Barry Taylor, who has joined us all the way from the United Kingdom. Glad to have you with us, Barry. How are you today?
I'm good, thank you. Good to be here. Not sure that our kingdom feels very united at the moment, actually. We seem to be growing apart, so we'll see what happens with that. But I'm happy to be here with a group of people who are coming together to talk about something. So
yeah, that sort of polarization seems to be just one of many pandemics affecting the globe as a whole, doesn't it?
I think so. That's probably another conversation.
An important one for sure. All right, glad to have you with us, Barry. Next up, we have Shonda Jha, who's the executive director at the Oakland Peace Center. Shonda has joined us a couple times for these conversations in the past. Always glad to have you. Welcome, Shonda. How are you?
Thanks so much. It is very good to be with you. Yeah, glad to be here with this group.
Awesome. Next up is Reverend Tim Burnett, who is the curator of the Way Collective, which is up in Santa Barbara, California. Always great to have you with us, Tim. How are you up in Santa Barbara?
Good to be here. Yeah, we're doing all right. I got a sick house of, my partner Kara and a couple of my kids are getting sick, but I'm still doing all right. So happy to be here and feeling good. So good to see y'all.
Super glad to have you with us. And last but not least, we have Dr. Robin Henderson Espinoza joining us, author of Activist Theology. And as she was just telling us, now teaching classes all over the country and giving talks from her home or their home right in Nashville, Tennessee. Is that right, Nashville? Did I get that right, Robin?
Yeah, the homestead is in Nashville.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us. We're really excited to have you with us.
Thank you.
Let's just jump in and kick off our conversation. I already sort of framed what we're going to be talking about today, but in a lot of ways, today's conversation feels like potentially the most fraught with difficulty, because a running theme throughout a lot of our conversations over the past 6 weeks has been how do we understand the gospel today to be a kind of faithful representation of what really is good news? What does it mean for the news that the church that proclaims to follow Christ brings to the community around us? We kind of talked about the pitfalls and the implications of that, but evangelism is one of those subjects that in more progressive leaning churches tends to be sort of off limits because of a lot of the baggage that it brings with it in terms of colonizing and coercion and demonizing out groups, so that you can create a sort of growing boundary wall between those who are in and those who are out. And just as I sort of say all that, it should be obvious that what I've just described are a lot of the problems that our communities are facing politically, that growing sort of dehumanization or demonization of those who are out groups. And so what does it mean for us to be faithful evangelists of a gospel that really is good news? And maybe for some of you, it means not engaging in evangelism. I want to leave the door open for that if that's your answer. But essentially, my question for all of you is, who do you evangelize, and how do you go about doing that? Do you engage in some kind of activity that looks like bringing good news to people as a person who still associates in some way with Christ? And if so, how have you come to understand that activity? How do you do it in a way that is faithful to your ethical commitments? Who would like to jump in and talk about how it is that they do that sort of work, if at all?
Well, if I could just have every head bowed and every eye closed, we could start there. Sorry, I figured I'd start with a little sarcasm.
That's good. No, I know that you've been there.
Yeah, I guess I could jump in. I think like all these questions, they're the task, I guess, or at least one of the tasks, is to work out what we mean by that and what the implications of it are, and how we understand what something like evangelism actually needs to be. You know, the context in which it occurs. I mean, I don't know that I ever sort of, in fact, I quite find myself quite often saying, you know, I'm not an evangelist, because I have no desire to convert anybody to anything that I'm into. I'm happy to talk with people about things that I'm interested in, but I feel no compulsion or obligation to achieve some definable goal in terms of you know, closing the deal on somebody else's life in terms of making sure that they know what I think they should know about God or whatever. I mean, I think the Christian tradition is one of those religions that is characterized by a kind of evangelistic impulse. You know, it goes out into the world and it attempts to sort of grow beyond its own kind of borders and boundaries. But again, I think it really depends on, for me, on how you pass out what all of that means. Like, are you doing it on behalf of some corporate organization? Are you doing it to impart a set of ideas that you think everybody should know about something, you know, some agenda, which I think is just simply little more than propaganda, personally. You know, it's propagandizing, it's just kind of sloganeering. And I'm, so, yeah, I don't know that I have a clear sense, other than I don't think it has to be understood in the way that it's perhaps been characterized, stereotyped, or even been practiced. But it depends, I think, so much on how you define what it means to believe, what it means to have encounters with people, and what kind of, you know, I mean, what kind of conversations you have with people. I mean, I think there's something actually kind of weird about going into a conversation with an agenda to achieve something. I've always found that, even when I was in my earlier sort of more churchy days, you know, in kind of more charismatic and evangelical environments, I always found that stuff just so weird, you know, like the car salesman pitch of Christianity. And I find it like a bit like a car salesman thing, you know, like this idea that the proof of evangelism is that you get results. I think if there's any proof of evangelism, it's probably invisible. But I don't know, I'll shut up. I figured I'd start off.
No, I mean, I appreciate you starting off that way. You've identified several of the issues that I think people, whether they have named it for themselves or not, find so distasteful about the notion of evangelizing. You even early on in your comments used the phrase "close the deal," And then, towards the end, made it explicit that you really see that sort of activity as like akin to being a car salesman. Well, nobody wants to have to sell cars or sell anything to anybody. I mean, some people do, I suppose.
I mean, I don't like to be sort of harsh particularly. I think it's just sometimes we operate without critical thinking and do things by rote because that's the way, certain people think they should be done, or that's the way it's traditionally been done. But I mean, you'd have to sort of look, I think, if you're serious about it, you'd kind of have to think about how that worked out historically throughout the life and the history of the tradition of Christianity. But then you'd have to think about, well, what needs to be said to anybody today, and what would you like to see happen from that? Because I mean, I think people think you evangelize because you want to build your church, which fair enough. But I don't know that necessarily quantifies as evangelism as it does group membership. And again, no judgment in that. But I think sometimes we over spiritualize sort of commercial practices to kind of justify what we're trying to do, and without even realizing that's what's going on, because we don't reflect on these things, which is why I think it's interesting that you have these conversations about very sort of simple notions that we all presume we know what that is and how that should be going on and how that should continue. And I should stop speaking now because there are other more intelligent people on this Zoom call, I think, not flying around in tin cans, but nevertheless.
So Barry, I really appreciated what you're saying, because it has me thinking about, evangelism. Y'all will have to forgive me because I don't know Greek super well, but that notion of evangelism comes from euangelion, right? The good news.
Yeah.
And I think one of the questions you're raising that I find is an important one is that question of good news for whom? And that doesn't tend to get investigated all that deeply when the term evangelism gets tossed around. And so the idea of that agenda-driven conversation being very inauthentic, I really appreciate. And confessionally, I am profoundly agenda-driven, because I think that, all right, y'all can help me because you know the evangelical world better than I do. The Pneuma video guy,
Rob
Bell.
Good job. I came up with it as well. So Rob Bell wrote this book a number of years back called Jesus Wants to Save Christians.
Sure. I
am very fond of that book because I think it's liberation theology for white folks. Because the version of Christianity that gets peddled is a death cult. And when I say that, I mean, my good friend Mickey just posted an article that said the 5 counties with the highest rates of COVID in this country voted for Donald Trump by 93%.
Sure.
It is a death cult in a tradition that prides itself on being about resurrection. And so that notion of good news for whom and towards what end, I think is a really important question to ask as we think about evangelism. Because I am 100% trying to evangelize, but who I'm trying to evangelize are people who have claimed Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior to get about the business of building the beloved community here on earth. I am basically inviting us into the work of community organizing, right? And I think that matters, because like what is the good news that we're peddling, and is it authentic or not? I think is kind of at the heart of what you're saying that I find really interesting.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, the truth of the matter is the good news is sort of different for everybody. I mean, I said many years ago that I think sometimes, the classic sort of evangelistic posture of, do you know that you're a sinner? You might want to sort of reframe that and ask people, let people know that we're sort of aware they've been sinned against, because there's an assumption that the pathway in is an acknowledgement of something that you may or may not be aware of. But what needs to be, what needs to be made clear to somebody, I think is contingent on lots and lots of variables, which why for me there's no such thing as mass evangelism. That's just induction into a cult. I mean, into a cult environment, where you're just creating a single pathway entry point that requires assent to things that actually are meaningless. Do you know Jesus Christ is your Lord and Savior? Well, how do you know that? I mean, and how do you know that on the night, apparently, that you've come down to the altar and you know nothing about Christianity? So what are you going to do? Oh, yeah. I mean, I don't understand that. I mean, I get that it's the way it's been done, but to me, that has no relevance or bearing on someone's existence personally. Because I think what happens is,
wrestle with that question of saved from what and saved for what, because I think those are treated as implicit and they're not.
Yeah, I wrestle with the whole idea of saved full stop. So
yeah, and I think in terms
of this notion of being either saved from or for anything, I think there's something else going on, but but I hear you. I think it's interesting. I like the idea of saving white people. I mean, I think it's a bit more complicated than that, but I get it. I totally understand.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a lot of people trying to save themselves from Christianity as we speak, by they're sort of holding on to, I mean, I think that's reflected in those sort of things like when people say, I'm spiritual but not religious. There's something in that actually is worth wrestling with, because I think it actually points to something very important about a changing climate of understanding about the very nature of how we understand the sacred in and of itself. And I think for a lot of people, that transition is an important one because you get that a lot from people that either have moved out of or won't go near more organized religious expressions because of a whole host of reasons, whether it's woundedness or disinterest or stuff. But I think that a lot of kind of post evangelicals and post theists and people in those kind of groups are essentially trying to work out how to save themselves from Christianity while holding on to Christianity in another way. And that's an incredible, delicate dance that everybody has to move with.
So what I love about this conversation so far is we've acknowledged that good news can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, including being saved or rescued from a form of Christianity that is death to them. So having just sort of acknowledged that, I want to keep the question on the table and point it towards either Robin or Tim, whoever might want to jump in. Who are you evangelizing and how are you doing it?
I always wanted to define our terms, because I'm not sure that I'm not sure that there's a single narrative of what evangelism is or what does it mean to evangelize. So for different traditions, it means different things. And in this moment in time, what does it even mean? What does our imagination tell us to evangelize? We know that Christianity has historically been a colonial project, and there is something akin to Christian supremacy that has dominated the world. And in my work as a theologian and ethicist, I want to steward a narrative about Christianity that composts its own supremacy culture.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would be much in line with what Sonia is talking about, that to evangelize is an invitation to community organizing, to compost our current reality and build a kind of culture that stewards wellness, and that includes a religious and spiritual wellness. And I know that there's a lot of people who would call themselves spiritual but not religious, but I kind of think I'm religious but not spiritual, in the sense that I have a habit of repeating practices that stewards a religiosity, whether it is through interpersonal relationship or through my public platform. And I'm trying to steward a kind of theology that doesn't care what people believe. And I write that in my book. I could give two shits what you believe, but I care about your politics. And I care about what you are practicing in your day-to-day life. How do you treat your neighbors? Where do you live? Where do you buy your coffee? What kind of world are you stewarding among your own culture? When I think about evangelism, I not only think about community organizing, but I also think about what is our world within worlds, and what kind of world are we trying to steward? We know that evangelical Christianity, at least here in the United States, is owned and colonized and all sorts of other dominance by conservative white men. But I'm of the opinion that that is a death cult, and it's a kind of stewardship into fear-based practices that actually doesn't steward wellness or a spirituality of wholeness. It stewards a spirituality of terrorism. And so I think one of the reasons why I wrote the book Activist Theology is to say that the Jesus narrative is not a single narrative, and it's not owned by a particular constituency in this country or globally. And we need to be people who steward multiple narratives around Christianity. I think we need to, instead of resting on creeds or confessions, what is the poetry of theology that helps us build the kind of world we long to inhabit? It's why I love what the Way Collective is doing around curating practices and values. I think that as a public theologian myself, it's what I talk most about, that our habits, our rituals, and those two combined can manifest justice. But what is the story that we're peddling?
Yeah, I mean, I don't need to add much. So much has already been opened up here, but I will say that, you know, and Robin just alluded to this, but our community is trying to decolonize our Christianity. A historically white church, you know, that has now been transfigured, if you will, into an alternative form of community. But the simple way that I always say it in our community is like, you know, capital R religion, what we've inherited, especially in Western Christianity, is really about 5 C's. It's crusade, coerce, convert, conform, and colonize. And that's the package. I mean, for better or worse, the good news has been tied up with that sense of needing to do those 5 things. And I thought, as Shonda said, as Robin said already, it's a death cult in a sense, and literally they hold on to that so tightly. That's why the bounded belief sets need to be so intact, because to get somebody to agree to a death cult, in a sense, you've got to crusade and coerce the world to conform to your thing very tightly. And so what we try to do is lowercase r religion, which I think is the question at the heart of this. What do we want to be bound together in, as a community? That's what the word religion means. Like what practices could form a community in a direction that would not be about any of those first 5 C's. And so we talk about things like connection and consciousness and curiosity and creativity and compassionate action as ways for us to rebind ourselves together in something that will not only decolonize the tradition we've inherited, but set us on a path that we can walk together where, as Barry said at the outset, there's no one sense that everybody needs to land. There's no place everybody needs to land. There's not a conformist mindset behind this. There's no one way to do it. There's just being together in community and walking a path together that can open us up to more. And I think what I found most fascinating about what y'all were already talking about was that I think there's a deep connection between this idea of radicalizing the gospel right now and radicalizing our politics for the sake of love, in a sense. But I think what people have been it's almost like this death cult sort of coercive theology has, in a sense, like raptured people off the hook for their own responsibility as political bodies. You know what I mean? It's like they've become so disconnected from the world and what it means to be in embodied relations with other people that the hyper spiritualization of it, and I joke about this idea of the rapture in their theology, has pulled them out of ever needing to answer for anything, anything terrestrial, in a sense, like anything relational and sticky and earthy. And so this gospel that's being peddled of this sort of escapism from embodiment is giving this populace of folks like an ability to be off the hook for anything moral, for anything good, for anything that would be good news to a community. So I just find that fascinating because that's intellectual, but it's also spirited, it's also embodied, and if you recognize like the way in which that type of news that is being peddled there functions, it puts you at odds with like life in a sense. So we're trying to do not that, I think, is all I'm really trying to say, and still be in community together. But evangelism, I think, as a we've not even done any marketing or anything in our community. It's all been word of mouth. So I don't know, we're raising up a community of people who are trying to be more open and alive, and I hope that spreads a bit, but I don't know. We haven't brought a lot of intentionality to that yet.
Yeah. I really appreciate you sort of ending on that note, because I want to ask another question that has more to do with how we speak about this to other people. But before we do, I just want to acknowledge a couple things that I'm hearing. The first is I really appreciate two kind of metaphors that have come up. One is the community organizing model. I think that if we're having a conversation about a kind of alternative politics or an alternative community, that's a really, really fruitful model to talk about in terms of there being an agenda that exists for people's well-being, for their good, or to borrow Robin's way of talking about it, that's healthy, right? Like actually good for people. And that will require some organizing. And I think that churches that are concerned about that, who have that agenda, have a lot to learn from the organizing community about how to do that effectively, particularly how to do it relationally. And so I'd love at some point before we get off this call to explore that a little bit. But then I also want to acknowledge the other sort of metaphor that's come up here is agricultural, right? And Robin specifically brought this up as this idea of growing something, not in terms of numerical growth, but growing something that's genuinely healthy and good. And I love Robin's use of the phrase composting supremacy, because I don't know that that is a notion I've ever heard anybody talk about, as in terms of taking what has come before, the good and the bad, and allowing it to die so that it can be composted for something that's good that can grow out of that soil. I think that's a really rich way of imagining this sort of work. And so just maybe establishing that as the image that we're working with, I want to say this. Number one, there's the positive side of that, the growing side of that. But then I really hear Barry sort of speaking about tilling that soil, right? So what I hear Barry really describing is the way that you speak about what has come before as a way of opening up like that hard ground so that people could be receptive to hear a new imagination. And so like Barry's words and phrases and objections to me feel like a plow that's trying to like break up that hardness so that something can be received. Now, I don't know if Barry would characterize it that way. He might totally disagree. That's fine. But that's kind of like the two-step thing that I hear happening here, is that this thing we're talking about, this witnessing, this evangelizing, has to do first with breaking up that old imagination so that something really good and new can grow. Any thoughts on like how we sort of live into that, or maybe objections to using that imagery?
Well, I have a couple of thoughts. I mean, if you want to stop me from going back here, feel free. But I think that and I hear what Tim's saying, and I don't disagree. But I think all religions that have an expansive desire colonize. It's not just Christianity, and it's not just Western Christianity. It's and religions to some degree and to varying degrees demand levels of conformity. I mean, that's part of it. Doesn't, that's denominational distinction, but it's still a certain kind of conformity that comes along, that comes with the territory. And I think there's another layer beneath that is actually, I wouldn't say it was more important, but I think it's as pertinent, is that, and the other thing I was going to say is that I think the kind of disembodied nature of contemporary Christianity is very much a reflection of the disembodied nature of late 20th century life. And I think we have to remember that religion doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens, Feuerbach said critically, all religion is social production. And that might be a critique against religion, but there's a sense in which all religion is culturally shaped and defined actually by more stuff than we realize. There's more stuff that influences and shapes the way we practice religion than I think we sometimes realize. And I think this move towards embodiment actually is reflected in the culture in a lot of ways. And the only sort of thing I'd want to say, and I'm not dissing it or dismissing it, I think it's really valid, but if community organizing and justice and all those things are really important and are the things that we should be going after, maybe the answer is to abandon the notion of the distinction of a church and just work with organizations that do that better. And maybe that's evangelism as well. I don't know. Maybe the whole notion of church as we understand it needs to no longer exist so that something else can manifest. But maybe I'm pushing that too far. And I'm not saying that I think that's what should happen, but I just think that what do I think? What was I trying to say? I don't know. I lost my train of thought. So, so that's what happened there. I don't know. And I don't mean that to be any way sort of dismissive. I just think that part of the deal here is that we're in the midst of significant cultural shifts and changes that are making demands upon Christianity that weren't there 50 years ago. And part of the failure of the lack of interest in Christianity, I think, is because the world has moved in different directions, and it's looking for different things. And I always feel like people are trying to drag the church there. And I just wonder sometimes if that's something to let go of and yet hold on to at the same time in terms of what we mean. Because I hear all the time, you know, people go, oh, church, I mean, as long as I was around Christianity, people go, oh, church is not buildings, it's relationships. Well, bullshit. Oh, sorry, I forgot Facebook. It's not true. It's not true. For most people, they still talk about going to church even when they say we're not a church anymore. We still are married to an idea of location and geography. That might be important, but I think the pandemic has challenged actually some of those notions about that. I think that in some ways there are some fruitful lessons to be learned from the way that digitality has allowed some communities to reframe how they connect with people. And I'm not saying, that's not me saying that people shouldn't get together, because I think there's something wonderful about people being together in community and groups. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't do that. I just wonder sometimes if we're not just trying to hold on to an idea, and that we need to let go of that central idea before we can start thinking about the other stuff. But probably not, I'm probably wrong. I don't mean that facetiously. I mean seriously. It's just, we're just talking here, so we're just talking, or I'm talking. Sorry, I feel like I'm talking too much.
I wonder if there's a both and opportunity here with combining what Barry is offering and with an idea, or I mean, I'm a utopian thinker, so I want to think that we can actually build the beloved community on earth. And I wonder if there's a way to weave together an analysis that actually creates conditions for a both and approach to relinquishing an idea of what Western Christianity has offered us, and looking at what goods emerge when we do come together, what goods emerge when we teach anti-violence on a cultural level, and how can we steward a kind of cultural knowledge production that achieves equity, or things like equity, liberation, fidelity to the earth, etc.
Yeah. Has anybody read that book by Gianni Vattimo, After Christianity? Gianni Vattimo is an Italian philosopher, kind of a Nietzschean philosopher, who actually came back to religion through Nietzsche, came back to Catholicism. And his sort of argument is that that secularity is actually the fulfillment of the Christian project in the Western world. That the ultimate end of Christianity is the disappearance of Christianity, and that what the role of Christianity in the 21st century is essentially to be a hospitable space for whatever needs to occur in order for people to realize the richness of their life the rich, like, no, I hate to use the word potential, but a rich life, a good life for themselves. And so that might mean that you make space for political activism or so on and so forth. But it's an interesting idea. I've sort of mulled it over for a number of years, just, and I, you know, like most ideas, it's kind of got its flaws and its challenges, and I don't buy the wholesale thing, but I do very much wonder if in some ways it doesn't tap it a little bit into all the things that everybody's sort of saying here, which is, because what I hear everybody saying really is kind of an expansion of the base of how we even understand what church or Christianity is really all about. Because, you know, if it is about community organizing, which I think it might well be, and if it's about justice, which I think it probably ought to be, and you know, kindness and all those things, maybe it doesn't need to be other things, and maybe it really, evangelism is, maybe the good news is a reprioritizing of whatever the story is in the context in which we find ourselves. I don't know.
Yeah, I actually think you're, oh, sorry, go ahead, Jason.
No, please.
So I think what's interesting about that, as you were talking, the story that was emerging for me was the story of the rich young ruler, right? And but we don't tend to think of that as an evangelism story, but it is a reprioritizing, and it is a reorienting, and it is an offering into good news if somebody wants to receive it, right? And it isn't a numbers game, because Jesus is like, you want some good news? The good news is you can be a part of this community of liberation. You can experience absolute freedom. You can be in, you know, the realm of the divine. And here's what it takes.
Yeah.
And he knows, I think, Jesus knows that the rich young man is going to walk away sad because he had many possessions. And I think that breaks Jesus's heart, and I think it's evangelism. And so I think that what terrifies me about the framework you were offering, about that notion of, and you even said, like, oh, I don't like using the word potential, because the human potential movement and the, you know, that new age movement has resulted in some incredibly dangerous white supremacist manifestations over the past 20, 30 years, because it hasn't liberated itself from the very dangerous heresy that is embraced very deeply in the United States of individualism, individual potential. And I think that matters. And I think that's why community organizing in and of itself isn't necessarily what anybody's advocating for here, because there's something different between community organizing that's removed from a spiritual framework and or secular community organizing. And I think what we're talking about here. And I didn't hear you advocating for radical individualism at all.
Oh, actually, my biggest problem with Christianity is the rampant hyper-individualism at its center.
Yeah,
I mean,
and that's definitely the colonial version of Christianity. That's absolutely how power disparities are kept in place.
I think it's the modern Western version of Christianity. If that's colonial, I can be corrected on that, but I think it's more related to developments from the Reformation, from the Enlightenment forward, and I think it's print culture that creates or contributed to individualism, you know, and this is the whole deal. If evangelism is based on we have to get people to have a personal relationship with God, then I'm not interested in evangelism, because I think I think that is actually an unnecessary weight. I mean, the thing for me is that there is so much responsibility on people today for everything, including spirituality. It's like, how's your spiritual life? You know, you have to take responsibility. You've got to do this and you've got to do that. I mean, in the Middle Ages, the religious were an actual class. They did the praying. Everybody else went about their business. The Reformation gave everybody the freedom and the responsibility for the care of their own spiritual existence, which on one level is very liberating. On another level, it's just one more pressure. It's like, you know, anybody can be a creative today, which is culture's way of saying the world can't guarantee you a long-term job anymore. So a 0-hour contract in the name of creativity is a really cool way of making it through. And it's sold back as this liberated way that you can engage in a system that actually keeps you oppressed. And so for me, no, rampant individualism is the last thing that I'm interested in, which is why I like the idea of, you know, I like community, but no. And that's the weird thing about Christianity. It frames it in hyper individual terms, and then wants everybody to collapse their individuality in some kind of strange sacrificial action towards God, where you give up actually all sense of yourself because you don't want to have some kind of idolatrous desire. And also then you have to conform and lose your individuality at the same time through the religious constraint.
which I think brings up something that has actually come up here a couple of times, right? Which is that whatever the gospel is, it often takes different forms for different people in different places at different times in order to meet their need for however salvation comes to be embodied in their life at that time, right? And so when I think about that, maybe just a very simple way of thinking about it is that for Jesus, the gospel oftentimes took on the image of setting a table for people, and at least once took on the image of him overturning tables for people, right? So the gospel in one setting, in one particular place, was Jesus, you know, turning all the tables over and making whips and driving people, you know, out of the temple. But in other situations, creating a space of hospitality, setting a table for people. So that's sort of that good news, bad news approach to evangelism, right? The gospel is always good news for some people and bad news for others, depending on who they happen to be in that situation. And so this reminds me a bit of a phrase Barry used at the beginning. And so maybe we could chat a little bit about this to kind of hone this conversation down into something maybe to force some of you to be a little bit more pragmatic, if at all possible. Early in the conversation, Barry, I don't know if he intended to do this or not, but he seemed to define evangelism as, quote, what needs to be said. And so I'd be interested in like hearing what you all think needs to be said in this time and in whatever place that you're in. What is it that people need to hear in order to break up that soil, you know, maybe to use sort of Barry's approach, or in order to plant seeds for something good that can grow, maybe to borrow Robin's approach? What do you think needs to be said right now?
Do you mean in general?
I think you could approach it any number of ways. Like what needs to be said in general for those of us who occupy Western civilization, if that's a thing, right? Whatever that means. United States, UK, obviously we're facing a whole wide variety of challenges in our communities. What is it that needs to be said now in order to bring health or wholeness or just to disrupt the destruction and death dealing that's happening? Or you could, you know, like for maybe somebody like Tim who's leading a community on the ground in a very specific locale, it could be hyper local to what's happening in Tim's neighborhood, in Tim's community, that he feels like needs to be said to people who live in Santa Barbara. I know that I would probably take that approach here in Oceanside. I'm much more concerned about what needs to be said here in North San Diego County and San Diego County in California than I am with what needs to be said in the UK. I have no idea what needs to be said in the UK.
Yeah, I think, to be honest, that's the smart approach. I think you can only speak honestly and openly to situations and circumstances that you have experience of. I mean, otherwise it's just abstract theorizing, and we can all do that. I mean, listen to me, I've been talking the last half hour in abstract, ideas. So, but I think that it really comes down to knowing what's going on with people. I think before we start telling people, we really need to start listening to people so that we know what's going on with them. I remember years ago, I was at this urban mission conference it was at Claremont, and there was a woman there from the Philippines, Melba Magay, and she was, one of those kind of barnstorming speakers, and she basically was talking about the fact that the Philippines was sort of largely immune to a lot of Western Christian impulse, and she said basically we didn't have the Enlightenment. We don't, you came with answers to questions that we weren't asking, and told us that those were the important questions that we should be thinking about. And I think sometimes we all do that in our own settings. We presume to know what it is that people need to know. And I think until we've listened to what's going on with people, and we can address the felt need, like you could argue at the moment, maybe we should be talking about anxiety, because everybody seems to be pretty darn anxious in one way or another. So maybe you could say we could have general conversations about anxiety at the moment that would hit an awful lot of people kind of in a shotgun way. But how's that manifesting with the people that we know? Then the good news is that once we know what is going on, then we can walk alongside somebody and talk with them about that, and not give them information, because I don't believe in the fix either, but to let someone know that they've been heard and understood, and you have no cure, but you've got some company.
So Barry's answer to the question is to listen, which means he has now outed himself as a community organizer. So I'm wondering, Shonda, Robin, Tim, what do you think needs to be said?
I wish that this were how I did evangelism consistently. There are 3 things that I think need to be said. And I deeply agree with it needs to be contextual, it needs to be local. And at the same time, I think these are 3 things I wish I could convey to every person that I've ever encountered. You are loved. There is enough. It doesn't have to be like this.
Yeah, that's good, right? Because it speaks, here's what I just really love about all of that. It speaks to one of the problems that came up early in this conversation, which is so much of traditional evangelism from a colonizing perspective is fear-based, right? So you are loved. I mean, hopefully people can we can demonstrate that that's true through practical action, that people are loved. There is enough. That's a pretty radical message in a competitive, capitalistic society, where we train people from birth to compete for goods and resources, right? Yeah, I mean, that just feels, we pressed it to its practical outcomes would be a pretty radical notion, and it can be different. That's a challenging message even now, like after November 3rd, when we narrowly ousted, one of the most toxic national leaders we've ever had in this country. It feels like a stretch to feel like things could be different. And so that feels radical to me too.
What's interesting about it is it's the most unifying thing I ever say in a space. Because everybody knows things are bad. Doesn't matter where they are, socioeconomically, politically, any of it. Everybody knows things are bad. And that word of it could be different can bring people together.
Yeah. So there's that dirty word possibility again. Okay. Robin, Tim, what do you guys think? What needs to be said?
I think that, I don't know if, yes, things need to be said. And my saying, or my speaking into this, is a question, which is, what kind of world do we want to inhabit? And what kind of humans do we want to be? And if we can discern the answers to those questions, it might help us contextualize our work in the world as evangelists for a different future. I'm constantly asking my friends and my colleagues, what kind of political future do we want to inhabit? And we can call it a religious future, we could call it a spiritual future, whatever. But I think that many of us are unclear on what kind of world we want to inhabit.
Yeah, and if I could, maybe, and I don't bring this up as a disagreement or a counterpoint at all. I'll just point out that for myself, one of the reasons why I think that there is an indispensable role for religious communities in our world is because religious communities are the stewards of the stories that help us have a prophetic imagination for how it could be better. And that there aren't many institutions in our world that have access to those really rich and disruptive and catalyzing stories that can depict a better possibility for people. And that of course raises all kinds of really serious problems, because if we insist on holding on to our religious stories, then that means that we have to also hold on to all of the pitfalls that those stories can bring when we continue to read them and to tell them. We can't approach that naively. We've all seen what happens when we take those stories and use them naively. But I don't know that dispensing with those really rich stories is the answer either. And so for me, there's always a place for institutions that embody tradition, because those traditions, when used rightly, help create those moments of prophetic imagination that lead to liberation.
Or as the comedian Mark Maron says, there aren't very many atheist soup kitchens.
Yes, although earlier, like in our conversation earlier, I almost pointed out that atheism for some people is the good news when they were presented with a kind of death-dealing religion, right? Like, I mean, it's completely understandable to me why anybody would eject notions of God in religion. But yeah, that's a great point. Tim, what about you? What do you think needs to be said?
I've been into silence these days.
Well done.
And I think part of that is because I'm a cis hetero Anglo dude, and it's partly contextual and local for me to learn a posture of listening. So there's that, but there's also there's a turn, I think, in not speaking so much toward what I can only sort of describe maybe as like a relationality. So the thing that emerges for me And, I want to be playfully kind of like the opposite of local in this, and talk universal for a second, is that we're all in this together. And that's a simple way to say that the ultimate is relational. And my friend's book just came out today, and it's called Mind, Value, and Cosmos, on the relational nature of ultimacy. But if we could somehow internalize the fact that we are deeply connected, I think this emerges in Deleuze's idea of folds, that the folds are already always connections. It emerges in Whitehead, and other metaphysicians. So I'm just kind of playfully being metaphysical here for a moment to say that, what if the very heart of things or thinginess is relations? And how would that transform the way we saw our religious perspectives? How would that transform the way we saw our nation states? How would that transform the way we saw our economics, and our collective life together? So for me, I think that's a compelling, if we're going to get theoretical, a little bit, and talk about the ideas themselves, this idea that we could say almost at a cosmic level that connectivity is vital for life together. I do think that that's a worthwhile consideration, because I think it leads us in a certain direction, civilizationally, when it comes to our choices in some of those registers I already named. But yeah, so for me, that would be something that emerges from the quiet these days.
I appreciate you bringing that up and moving us towards the universal, because, it occurs to me while you're referring to process theologians, John Cobb wrote a book recently provocatively enough, called Salvation, and in which he sort of unpacks the fact that for Christ, the salvation that he brought in the message of the kingdom of God was essentially a message of deliverance from the existential threat that was the Roman Empire towards Israel, right? And how for us to understand the good news or salvation today, being faithful to that notion means that we have to take seriously the existential threat that we're all facing globally in terms of ecological crises like climate change. And so maybe we could just talk about that for a second. And the reason I want to talk about it is partly because Tim brought it up, and partly because I feel like one of the things that happens is every time like liberals or progressives talk about the gospel or salvation, that we always sort of push the conversation to issues like ecology. And then I see people who are, sort of more traditional or maybe more conservative, their eyes sort of glaze over, and they don't want to like talk about these sort of esoteric ideas that have in their minds nothing to do with religion whatsoever. But the truth is like, as a globe, as a species, we're facing an ecological and existential crisis. If there's nothing that can unite us, if anything could unite us, I should say, it seems like it should be that. And so what role do religious institutions have in sort of reinterpreting salvation in those terms, and in terms of like saving ourselves from our own self-destruction in the next couple of decades?
Yes, I just want to say yes to all that.
Well, I'm going to disagree with John Cobb, because I think personally, and doesn't matter, but I think the existential threat that Jesus was talking about was the internal existential threat of his own religion, not the threat of, because I think it's always easy to externalize the problem outside oneself. And I think the problem is always first and foremost an internal problem in terms of how we connect and disconnect, relate and don't relate to the rest of the world. And my take on the Gospels is the disconnections made through the extreme over interpretation of Judaism's own identity. So you wind up with the Pharisees with hundreds of laws that they've added in, just to make sure that they're on the right side of purity and stuff like that. So I think the church is always good at pointing out what's wrong with the world. Not so good at pointing out what's wrong with us, but it's like us as human beings. I can solve anybody else's problems, but I'm a walking nightmare. You know what I mean. But I do think I do think the notion of ecology in terms of things in relationship with each other and benefiting each other and strengthening each other is a very important idea. And it's a word that people are starting to use a lot, even in like business and things like that. People are talking about creating ecological systems, where there's a realization that it's not just form and structure, but it's the kind of relationship between forms that are really important. And then the whole liberal, progressive versus fundamentalist conservative conversation, I think both ends of that spectrum, they should just cut that cord and just, I think I have no interest in, because I think they're actually talking about the same things. The central core of both ends of that spectrum is still connected to supernaturalism or naturalism. So you've either got people trying to redefine how to think about a metaphysical God, or you've got people changing, inserting the word universe instead of God. So the universe is for you, which I think is like, I don't know what even to make of that statement. It's just like saying God is for you. Yeah, sure, maybe, but I'm not sure that I can go there. So for me, that conversation is the conversation, whether it's progressive, liberal, conservative, or fundamentalist. It revolves around a set of ideas that I no longer hold to. So I can respect somebody wanting to have those conversations, but it's difficult for me because I think they're mired in perspectives that, again, I think aren't helpful in the times in which we live.
Yeah, I mean, in
England for a long time.
Yeah. I see it as a bit of a both and. I think that the Cobb's maybe analysis of salvation and what you just brought up, Barry, are consonant. Yeah. Like I think of like Dorothy Sulla, who talks about erasing the boundary between the religious internal and the political external, and the fact that when we liberate ourselves from our religion, that our relations become very evident to us, and we start to learn kindness in our relations. And but for me, I think another thread I've heard actually peppered throughout this entire conversation, but one I wanted to bring up right now too, is that there's an author named Bayo Komolafe who talks about God as rupture, not rapture. So if we're talking about something like the universe is for you, God is for you, like God, if God is anything, whether that's a linguistic move or not, is a way to talk about the rupture at the heart of our inquiry, and that what he says emerges in an essay he calls "Coming Down to Earth," like making sanctuary is what he calls it. Making sanctuary for each other is actually about letting the monsters out, letting the monsters free to roam. And that what happens when we inquire, I love that you turned us toward our own religious movement to inquire of it, is to say that the monsters are welcome, so that we can be together and create sacredness around those things that need to be exorcised and those things that need to be addressed, and the transformations that need to take place in order for us to move toward what Robin was opening up for us as an image of this beloved community. So but I think that we're all sensing this emergence of, and trying to speak to it. But I think it's going to be in our our continuing pressing in as in conversations like this and in communities to enact it.
Yeah, great. I like that idea.
Robin can have the last word because I know we're almost at time. And so I really appreciate a lot of what was shared already. I do find myself thinking, traditional Christianity gives the Pharisees a bad rap. I'm just going to put that out there, because surviving an empire manifests in a whole bunch of different ways. And the Pharisees and the Essenes and the Zealots, I mean, I hope I would have been a zealot, but the way we survive empire manifests in a whole bunch of ways for oppressed communities. And the Jewish people in the time of the Roman Empire were an oppressed people. And so it's super on brand for John Cobb to be like, and the equivalent crisis is ecology. And it's not that that's untrue, but I feel like the analogy is actually the empire that created the ecological crisis today, right? I was visiting my family in India last year, and there's a whole Bangladesh, we're a walking distance from Bangladesh. There's a whole Bangladeshi community there because they're climate refugees. No one in the community calls them that. They call them terrorists or maids, but they are climate refugees. And then I visited my mother's little island in Scotland, tiny working class little island that probably won't be there in 50 years, right? So who is destroyed by this? Yeah, it's all of us, but it's happening in a particular order. And so the empire is still real. It's not like it went away when Rome fell. And the good news continues to be the same good news, which is we have the capacity to resist, to survive, and to potentially overturn it. And I think that does require the divine partnership. And I do think it is literally the evangelion. And so I love John Cobb, and God bless that beautiful, beautiful man in his very particular social location, who sometimes remembers that inequality is always baked into every crisis and sometimes forgets. But we don't have to forget.
Yeah.
I think I maybe just want to add a comment to when we relinquish this notion of a transcendence in religion and we focus on connection, relationality, in what is present in the now, I think we get a different picture of what both religion and spirituality both are. And, you know, maybe we need to, the tradition is not innocent. And maybe we need to relinquish some of our knuckle-handed grips on the things that we feel like we need to hang on to the most in order to actually allow for an emergence of relationships to manifest, so that we can actually be connected to practices that steward a better future. I think that's the only thing I would add.
Thank you for adding that. I'll just maybe close by observing that it feels to me like much of what we've talked about today, what you all have contributed, is an image of death and resurrection. We've talked a lot about old conceptions of Christianity and old models, old institutions of Christianity dying, and then something new being birthed. And that new thing not necessarily being a Christianity that exists for its own sake, but a Christianity that exists for the sake of perhaps midwifing, or in some way, in a more humble way, contributing to a better future for all people. And you've all sort of said that in different ways. Barry said it very explicitly earlier in the conversation when he said, maybe, the church just needs to die. And it occurred to me that when he said that, of course, that part of the message the church carries is a message of death. If anybody should be good at dying, it's people who follow a person who literally died so that something new could be born. And so perhaps that's what good news looks like for some folks, is the news that this thing is dying and that there is something new being formed that's creating better possibilities for people in our communities. And so I appreciate everybody bringing sort of your thoughts to the table around what that could look like. I think what's clear is that we don't have really good definitions for folks who are trying to reconceptualize what church might look like after a more sort of white supremacist, colonizing expression of Christianity. But there are lots of people who are hopeful about that possibility. And so I appreciate that you're all willing to join with me today. Thanks everybody again. So we have Barry Taylor. I appreciate you coming all the way out from the UK. I don't know what time it is there, but it has to be dark.
Yeah, well, it's been dark since 4 p.m. It's only 8:30, so I'm good.
Oh, good. Always a pleasure to have a conversation with you and to hear your insights. So thank you very much. Shonda Jha, always a pleasure as well to have you joining us all the way from Northern California. And Tim Burnett, always a pleasure to have you as well. And blessings to you and your work at the Way Collective.
Likewise, Jason. These are super fun.
Yeah, Robin Henderson Espinoza, super fun to have you joining us today all the way from Nashville. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks so much for the welcome. Appreciate it.
All right, guys, have a great day.
Bye. Nice to meet you.